Danielle Grayson had never expected a day at the bank to unravel her world. For months, the thought had been gnawing at her in the back of her mind, a quiet whisper that kept coming back no matter how hard she tried to ignore it. It was simple at first, a fleeting concern, easy to dismiss, but the more she thought about it, the more it began to occupy her mind. Was Grayson Trust truly the institution she envisioned when she built it from the ground up? As the CEO of Grayson Trust, Danielle had dedicated years to crafting a financial institution that stood out, built on values of fairness, accessibility, and trust. She wasn't just a figurehead sitting behind a desk, overlooking a gleaming cityscape. No, she had put in the work, pouring her heart into making sure that Grayson Trust was more than just a bank. It was supposed to be a beacon of integrity in an industry often riddled with inequality. But was it? Danielle had heard whispers, rumors, stories from friends, casual comments from trusted colleagues. It wasn't anything overt, nothing that would ever make the evening news, but there were murmurs about how some branches treated customers differently than others. At first, she dismissed them. After all, Grayson Trust had a strict set of policies in place: anti-discrimination measures, customer service guidelines, protocols for fairness, all on paper. But policies were just words. Real change came from actions. That was the question that kept her awake at night. Was she truly upholding the values she claimed to represent? Or was there something more insidious happening under the surface? The idea of testing it had sat quietly in her mind for a while now, but today it was no longer a distant thought. It was time for answers. And for that, she needed to step outside the glass-walled office she had spent years building, outside the role of the CEO, and become just another customer, someone who could experience firsthand how Grayson Trust treated the people it was supposed to serve. So Danielle Grayson arrived at a branch in Indianapolis on a quiet afternoon. No expensive blazer, no silk blouse, no designer heels, just a simple cardigan, jeans, and sneakers. She walked into the bank with one goal in mind: to test her own institution, to see if the whispers were true. Would she, as just another woman walking in off the street, be treated with the same respect as any other customer? Or would she find something else altogether? The automatic doors of the branch slid open, and the familiar scent of freshly printed paper and industrial-strength air freshener filled the air. She glanced around. The lobby was calm. Only a few customers were waiting in line. A teller was balancing a cash drawer at the far end, while a couple of other customers sat in the waiting area, chatting quietly. Danielle adjusted her bag on her shoulder, taking a deep breath as she approached the counter. She was ready. Ready to find out whether her vision for Grayson Trust was truly being realized or if something darker was at play. The young teller at the counter, a woman in her mid-20s with pale skin and dark hair pulled back into a tight ponytail, glanced up as Danielle stepped forward. There was no greeting, no smile, just a quick once-over before she shifted her attention back to the screen in front of her. Danielle cleared her throat. "Hi, I'd like to make a withdrawal," she said, trying to sound as casual as possible. The teller didn't look up. Instead, she reached for a clipboard and slid it across the counter. "Fill this out," she instructed, her tone flat and impersonal. Danielle didn't hesitate. She grabbed the pen from her bag and began filling out the form. Nothing out of the ordinary. Her name, account number, withdrawal amount, $5,000. Not a huge sum, but enough to trigger the usual verification process. She slid the completed form back toward the teller. The shift came instantly. The teller's eyes flicked over the form, then to Danielle's ID. Her brows furrowed, lips pressing into a tight line. Danielle noticed the hesitation immediately. It was subtle, but it was there. The teller's fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment longer than necessary before she placed Danielle's ID back on the counter, as if deliberating. I'll be right back," the teller muttered, her voice slightly strained. Danielle watched as the teller walked briskly away, disappearing behind a door leading to the manager's office. The weight of the moment settled on her shoulders, but she didn't move. She wasn't going to leave, not without answers. The quiet tension in the lobby thickened. People shifted uncomfortably. A man behind her, dressed in business attire, shifted his weight as he waited his turn. Danielle noticed he had been greeted immediately when he stepped up to the counter. No hesitation, no scrutiny. Another woman across the room was chatting easily with a different teller. No delays, no extra steps. Danielle felt her patience begin to wear thin. She had been standing there for nearly 5 minutes now, waiting for an explanation, waiting for something that shouldn't even be happening. But she knew. She knew what was going on. This wasn't about banking policies. This wasn't about security procedures. No, this was about something else entirely. It was about her. She stood there still, watching the door behind the counter, knowing exactly what was happening on the other side. And when the door finally swung open again, she wasn't prepared for what was to come. The door to the manager's office swung open, and the teller reappeared, not alone this time. A middle-aged man, stocky with rimless glasses, stepped into view. His name tag read Todd Larson. He looked at Danielle with a controlled politeness, but it didn't take long for her to realize it wasn't genuine concern. It was a carefully constructed mask. Todd's approach was calculated, his movements slow and deliberate, like he was preparing for something. Danielle didn't need to be in banking to recognize the way he was assessing her. She had seen that look in the eyes of people who had already decided what they thought of her, what her worth was in their eyes. "Afternoon, ma'am," Todd said, his voice even, almost too smooth. "I understand you're trying to make a withdrawal." Danielle nodded once, her posture still straight, her expression firm. "That's right. $5,000. My account, my ID," she replied, the words coming out calmly, but there was an edge to her voice now. Todd glanced at the teller, then back at her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Mind if I take a quick look at your identification?" His tone was polite, but it was also patronizing, as if to suggest her ID wasn't enough. Danielle exhaled slowly, giving him a level stare. "I already gave it to her." Todd ignored the comment entirely, picking up her ID as if he were inspecting an object, rather than acknowledging a person. He held it up to the light, studying it carefully. Danielle could feel the moment stretch into something uncomfortable. The more he scrutinized her ID, the more she felt the weight of the situation settling in her chest. "Miss Grayson, is this your first time banking with us?" Todd asked, the question too casual to be genuine. It was as if he didn't believe she belonged there in the first place. Danielle's stomach churned. The question was laced with an unspoken implication. Was she really who she said she was? Was she worthy of being here? She let out a breath, trying to keep her voice steady, but the sharpness in her tone betrayed her. "I've been banking here since this branch opened." Todd didn't respond immediately, as if the information wasn't enough for him. Instead, he nodded slowly, his eyes still flicking over her ID, then back at her face. "And you said you're withdrawing $5,000? Danielle nodded, her frustration mounting. "That's what I wrote down." Todd didn't seem to hear her, or maybe he didn't care. He turned the ID over in his hands as if the details on the back might offer some hidden clue. Then, as though the moment required extra emphasis, he asked another question. "And what do you do for work, Miss Grayson?" Danielle blinked, her mind processing the question. It wasn't a typical banking inquiry. It was a way to gauge who she really was. She hadn't expected to be asked about her profession, not after she had already handed over her ID. Still, she kept her composure. "I'm in finance," she replied, careful to keep her tone neutral. Todd paused for just a second longer than necessary, his eyes narrowing just a bit more, as if the word finance didn't quite satisfy him. Then, as if he had caught on to something, he asked the question that felt like a slow burn. "Oh, what kind of finance?" he asked, and this time his tone was almost patronizing, as if banking was something beneath him, a subject to be interrogated like a trivial matter. Danielle's patience was rapidly thinning, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Banking," she said firmly, emphasizing the word so he couldn't miss it. Todd's face remained smooth, but the subtle tension in his eyes betrayed him. There it was. He had finally realized who she was. But now that the truth had come to light, he wasn't willing to back down. Instead, he pressed further. "I see," he said, drawing the words out. "And this is a personal account, correct? Not a business one?" Danielle's jaw tightened. This wasn't normal. This wasn't how banking was supposed to work. She folded her arms and took a step back. "That's what it says on the form," she said, keeping her voice steady, but it was clear the situation had crossed a line. Another slow, calculated nod from Todd. He turned her ID over again, running his thumb along the edge of the plastic, stalling. Then, without any further warning, he dropped the bombshell. "Unfortunately, we won't be able to process this withdrawal at this time." Danielle's heart skipped a beat. "Excuse me?" Todd's expression didn't shift. He didn't look concerned, didn't seem to care that she was growing increasingly frustrated. "We're unable to verify the transaction," he said, as if it were just another day at the office. Danielle blinked, her mind racing. "What do you mean?" "You have my ID, you have my account number. What is there to verify?" Todd clasped his hands together, a practiced gesture of professionalism, though it did nothing to hide the tension in his voice. "It's just a precaution. We take security very seriously," he explained, but the words felt hollow. "Security?" Danielle echoed, her mind reeling. "This isn't about fraud. It's $5,000, a fraction of what I have in this account. I've followed every protocol you have in place. So let me ask you again, what's the real issue here?" Todd's mask cracked for just a moment. He hesitated, his hands tightening on the counter, but he quickly recovered. "We just need to confirm a few details before proceeding," he said, his voice becoming more distant, colder. "It's just part of our due diligence." Danielle could feel her patience slipping away, but she held on to her composure. "What details?" Todd hesitated again. Then he asked a question that made Danielle's blood run cold. "Can you tell me the last deposit amount made to this account?" Her stomach dropped. That wasn't normal. That wasn't something they typically asked for a withdrawal. Security questions for big amounts, sure. But this? It felt like something else entirely. Something personal. Something meant to put her in her place. Danielle stood tall, refusing to back down. "I don't have that number memorized," she said evenly, though the growing frustration was hard to contain. "But if you pull up my account like you would for anyone else, you'll see all my deposits." Todd gave her a thin, practiced smile. "Of course," he said, but there was no sincerity in his words. "But in the interest of security, we need to make sure the account holder can confirm certain details first." Her fingers dug into her palms as she fought to stay calm. "I just gave you my ID," she said, her voice strained now. Todd's smile remained. "You'd be surprised how often fraudulent IDs come through," he added, his tone dismissive. Danielle took a breath, trying to steady herself. "I'm not withdrawing millions, Todd. It's $5,000. She could see the gears turning in his head, the way he was trying to keep control of the situation. But this wasn't about banking. This wasn't about security. It was about something far more personal, about who he thought she was and who he thought she wasn't. She had already given him every detail he asked for. There was no reason to continue this charade. But Todd wasn't finished. He wasn't done making this difficult. "Would you like to try using a different form of verification?" he asked, his words dripping with condescension. "Perhaps a utility bill or a second form of ID?" Danielle's heart raced with disbelief. A second ID? For her own account? She couldn't hold back the laughter that slipped out, soft, bitter. "You want me to provide a second form of ID for my own bank account? Where you're holding my money?" She shook her head slowly, unable to process the absurdity of the request. This was no longer about banking. This was about something far uglier. She wasn't just a customer. She was a test, a challenge to the assumptions people like Todd held about her. And if he thought he could push her out, he was wrong. She wasn't going anywhere until she got answers. Danielle's frustration was boiling over, but she held on to her composure, trying to maintain control. The situation had escalated in a way that felt all too familiar. She had encountered people like Todd before. The ones who made assumptions, the ones who thought they could silence her with bureaucratic red tape, the ones who believed they had the power to decide where she belonged. But this was different. She wasn't going to let it slide. Not this time. Todd, as if sensing the tension in the air, was still holding her ID, his fingers gripping it just a little too tightly. The words he had been saying, each one more dismissive than the last, were no longer registering. She had heard enough. Now it was time for him to hear her. She leaned in slightly, narrowing her eyes as she locked her gaze with his. "You know what's funny, Todd?" she began, her voice measured but sharp, the calmness hiding the storm within. "I watched you process that man's transaction just 10 minutes ago. No extra verification, no manager intervention, no security called." Todd's expression faltered for just a moment, the mask he had carefully constructed slipping slightly. His eyes flicked toward the security guard, who had been standing there, observing the whole exchange. Danielle could feel the shift in the room, the subtle tension that rippled through the space. The customers had stopped pretending not to notice. They were watching now, not just the scene unfolding, but the people who were responsible for it. Danielle continued, her voice cutting through the growing silence. "I wonder what's different about me," she said, her words lingering in the air like a challenge. Todd froze, his face turning pale. For the first time in this entire ordeal, he seemed uncertain. His throat bobbed as he swallowed, and the tight, controlled smile he had been wearing began to falter. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. He was scrambling, trying to find a way out of the corner he had backed himself into. But there was no way out, not anymore. She stepped closer to the counter, her body language unyielding. "You know what's even funnier, Todd?" she said, the words sharp and deliberate. "You're refusing to process a withdrawal of $5,000, a fraction of what I have in my account, even though I've provided everything you've asked for. But if I were standing here in a tailored suit, if I were a man, if I looked like what you expect a CEO to look like," she let the words hang in the air, "you and I wouldn't be having this conversation." The tension in the room was palpable now. The other customers in the lobby, who had been pretending not to notice, were no longer hiding their curiosity. Danielle could feel their eyes on her, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone. But it wasn't just about them. It wasn't about the other customers. It was about Todd, the man who had just crossed a line he didn't realize he had. Todd's expression shifted, his eyes narrowing as he tried to regain some semblance of control. "This isn't about appearance," he said, his voice flat, though it lacked the confidence it had earlier. "It's about policy." Danielle let out a short, humorless laugh. "Is that right?" she said, her voice dripping with disbelief. "You want to talk about policy? Because if we're talking about policy, then you should know I helped write some of those policies. I helped establish the guidelines that are supposed to ensure customers are treated fairly. So don't talk to me about policy." Todd opened his mouth to respond, but before he could get another word out, Danielle's phone buzzed quietly in her bag. The noise, though soft, was a sharp reminder that this was being recorded, and she wasn't about to let him get away with this. She reached into her bag, her fingers brushing against the cold surface of her phone. She pulled it out slowly, deliberately. The movement was intentional, a silent declaration that the moment had shifted. No longer was this just a conversation about a withdrawal. Now it was about power, about control, about the systemic assumptions that had been allowed to fester in her own institution. And Danielle was not going to let that go unchecked. She turned the camera on, and in one smooth motion, she began recording. "You see, Todd," she said, her voice cool and steady as the camera captured the scene, "you're refusing to allow me access to my own account, despite providing government-issued identification. You've made me jump through hoops that no one else here has had to. And now, you've called security over for what reason exactly?" The security guard, who had been standing off to the side, looked momentarily caught off guard. His hand instinctively moved toward his belt, but he didn't speak. He was just waiting for instructions. Danielle turned the camera toward him, capturing his confused, uneasy expression. "Are you here to help me access my money?" she asked, her voice steady. "Or just to escort me out?" The guard hesitated, glancing at Todd, who gave him a tight nod. The guard's posture softened slightly, as if he was beginning to understand that something wasn't right. Danielle's focus remained on Todd, her eyes locking with his. Todd opened his mouth, his lips trembling slightly. "Miss Grayson, I sincerely apologize for this misunderstanding," he stammered, but the apology felt hollow. "This was just a misunderstanding. We can process your withdrawal right away." Danielle took a step back, her phone still recording, capturing every word. "No, she said firmly. It's too late for that. Todd's face paled further as he realized that he had lost control of the situation. His attempt at an apology wasn't enough. Not now. The damage had been done. You've crossed a line, Danielle continued, her voice cold. And now I'm going to make sure you understand the consequences. Todd's mouth moved, but no words came out. Danielle wasn't sure if he was trying to backpedal or if he was too scared to speak. But it didn't matter. Not anymore. She took a breath and let it out slowly, her gaze shifting toward the security guard and the teller who had watched everything unfold. This is the last time something like this happens in my bank, she said, her voice clear and resolute. The last time someone is treated like this. The last time someone is made to feel like they don't belong. Todd didn't respond, and the room fell into a suffocating silence. Danielle stood there, the weight of her words settling on the air like a challenge. She turned her attention to the teller who had been standing frozen at the register, eyes wide with a mix of fear and confusion. You saw my ID, Danielle said, her voice unwavering. You had my account information, and yet you decided that I wasn't worth listening to. What does that say about your protocol? The teller's eyes darted away, unable to meet her gaze. Danielle didn't let her off the hook. Maybe it's time to ask yourself why protocol only seems to apply to people like me, she said quietly, her words slicing through the air like a blade. Turning on her heel, she headed toward the exit. The door opened automatically in front of her, but before stepping through, she paused, glancing back at the stunned faces in the lobby. Corporate will be in touch, she said, her voice cool and final. And Todd, she added, turning back to the man who had just tried to undermine her. You might want to start looking for a new job. The door closed behind her, but the weight of the moment lingered in the air long after she left. And the storm that would follow, the ripple effects of what had just happened, were only beginning to take shape. Danielle Grayson wasn't going to let this go. Not this time. Not ever again. The drive home was a blur. Danielle's thoughts were racing, a whirlwind of anger, frustration, and disbelief. She had expected to face some kind of resistance. After all, it was clear that Todd had already made up his mind about her. But the lengths he had gone to, the blatant assumptions, the refusal to acknowledge her authority in her own bank, it had crossed a line she wasn't willing to ignore. By the time she arrived at her house, the adrenaline that had been fueling her all afternoon began to fade, replaced by a deep sense of exhaustion. She stepped inside, dropped her keys on the kitchen counter, and sank into a chair. Her phone buzzed and she glanced at the screen, half expecting a call from Todd, maybe an apology. But it wasn't Todd. It was an email notification from her assistant, Caitlin. The subject line read, Urgent Grayson Trust Incident. Danielle clicked it open. Caitlin had already heard about the incident. The email was full of questions. What happened? What were the next steps? Should she call a meeting? Should they inform corporate? Danielle rubbed her temples. This was happening faster than she had expected, but she knew she couldn't let it sit for long. She typed a quick response, asking Caitlin to set up an emergency meeting with her leadership team first thing in the morning. Danielle needed everyone to hear what had transpired and to ensure that this was handled correctly. But that wasn't the only message she had waiting for her. As the evening wore on, her inbox began filling with messages from people within the company, colleagues, and even a few concerned customers who had somehow gotten wind of the incident. Some were sympathetic, others were surprised. But one email stood out, a message from her head of human resources, Angela Ford. The subject, bias training, immediate action required. Danielle's heart rate picked up. She opened the email, and Angela's words hit her like a punch. We cannot ignore the gravity of what happened today. The actions of Todd Larson and the teller at that branch are not just embarrassing, they are a violation of our core values. I suggest we implement mandatory bias and inclusion training across all branches immediately. This needs to be a company-wide effort, starting with a full review of customer service protocols and training programs. We must demonstrate that Grayson Trust stands for fairness, and this starts with addressing what happened today. Danielle knew Angela was right. The problem wasn't just about a single incident. It was a systemic issue that ran deeper, one that she had been turning a blind eye to for far too long. The fact that someone like Todd could hold such prejudices, act on them with such impunity, and not even realize the damage he was doing was a reflection of the culture she had allowed to thrive in certain corners of the company. She stared at her phone, her fingers tapping against the screen as she read and reread Angela's message. She had always prided herself on creating an environment at Grace and Trust where people felt respected and valued. But today's events had exposed something far uglier than she had ever anticipated. This wasn't just about Todd Larson's behavior. This was about the culture that allowed it to happen. And if she didn't address it head on, it would never change. She set the phone down, standing up from the chair and pacing around the kitchen. What she had done at the bank today, standing up for herself, recording the exchange, calling out Todd for his discriminatory behavior, was just the beginning. She knew she needed to take swift action. The company needed a reckoning. The next morning, the meeting room at Grace and Trust headquarters was filled with the key players in the company, the leadership team, HR, and a few senior branch managers who had been called in at the last minute. Danielle had made it clear that this was an emergency and no one was to be left out. As she stood at the front of the room, the weight of what had happened the day before hung heavy in the air. She could see the surprise on their faces, the disbelief in some of their eyes. But no one said anything as she began speaking. "I'm sure you've all heard what happened at the Indianapolis branch yesterday," Danielle began, her voice steady, but her words carrying a weight that was hard to ignore. "I went in there as a customer, expecting the same treatment everyone else gets. Instead, I was treated with suspicion, and not only was I refused service, but I was humiliated in front of other customers." She paused, letting the words sink in. She had already spoken with Todd Larson last night. He had apologized, of course, but the apology had been too little, too late. He had tried to explain himself, tried to cover up his actions by blaming the situation on policy. But Danielle knew the truth. It wasn't about policy. It was about bias, assumptions, and quite frankly, the complete lack of accountability. "I'm not here to dwell on what happened yesterday," she continued, looking each person in the room squarely in the eye. "I'm here because we have a problem that's been allowed to fester for too long. Todd Larson's actions yesterday didn't happen in a vacuum. They happened because we have a culture that hasn't been held accountable for its own biases, and we've been ignoring it." The room was silent, save for the soft shuffle of papers and the nervous shifting of people in their seats. Danielle could feel the eyes on her, some filled with guilt, others filled with uncertainty. But she wasn't going to sugarcoat it. "I've made the decision to implement immediate changes," she said, her voice unwavering. "First, we are rolling out mandatory bias and inclusion training for every employee across all branches. Not just for managers, but for tellers, customer service reps, and security personnel. Everyone. We are also reviewing our customer service policies, and we will be enforcing zero tolerance for any kind of discrimination, whether it's overt or subtle. No one will get away with this again." A few people in the room nodded, some appearing uneasy, others more resolute. Angela Ford, who had joined the meeting remotely, spoke up next. "Danielle, I completely agree," she said. "We've already started putting together a comprehensive training program. We'll also be creating an anonymous reporting system for employees and customers to report any form of discrimination or mistreatment they witness. We'll make sure there's a clear path for action when these situations arise." Danielle turned to face her senior branch managers. "This is your responsibility as much as it is mine. If you see anything, if you hear anything, you need to speak up. We're not going to let this be swept under the rug any longer. This is a chance for us to do better, to actually walk the walk instead of just talking the talk." The weight of her words hung in the air, but there was also something else. Resolve, a sense of purpose. Danielle knew she had a long road ahead of her, but today was the first step in changing the culture of Grace and Trust. It wouldn't be easy, but she was ready. After the meeting, she sent out a company-wide email outlining the changes she had announced. She also addressed the Indianapolis branch incident, ensuring that it was made clear that no one would be protected if they failed to uphold the bank's core values. The response was overwhelming. Employees expressed relief, customers sent messages of support, and some even shared their own stories of mistreatment. Danielle had done what she set out to do. She had started a conversation that had been long overdue, but there was still a lot of work to be done. The changes she had made would take time to implement, But one thing was certain. This wouldn't be the last time someone stood up for what was right at Grayson Trust. She had made her point, and now she was going to make sure the rest of the company got the message loud and clear. Later that evening, as she sat down to dinner, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from Todd Larson. It was brief, an apology, a promise to do better. Danielle didn't respond. She didn't need to. She knew that the real work would happen in the coming weeks, in the classrooms where bias training would take place, in the meetings where employees would be held accountable, and in the everyday actions of everyone at Grayson Trust. She didn't need Todd's apology. She needed change. And that was what she was going to make sure happened. And she wouldn't stop until it did. Days turned into weeks, and Danielle's world seemed to shift under the weight of the changes she had set in motion. The emails kept coming in, requests for more information, inquiries from customers, messages from employees wondering what the future held. She had expected some pushback, but the overwhelming support from both sides of the equation surprised her. The first wave of mandatory bias and inclusion training kicked off across the company. Every branch manager, every teller, every employee, from the front lines to the back offices, was required to participate. Grayson Trust had never done anything like this before, and the effort was massive. But the reception was encouraging. Danielle received feedback from employees who admitted they had never considered how unconscious bias could affect their interactions with customers. Many were surprised at how much they learned, how much they could improve. But while there was progress, the road ahead remained long. Not all the feedback was positive. Some employees, particularly those who had been with the company for years, bristled at the idea of being told they had biases to overcome. It wasn't easy for them to accept. Old habits died hard, and not everyone was willing to confront the uncomfortable truths about themselves. Danielle knew that the true test wouldn't come from the employees who embraced the changes. It would come from those who resisted. How far was she willing to push for a company that upheld its values? How much disruption was she willing to accept to achieve real change? It was nearly a month after the Indianapolis incident when Danielle got the call from Caitlin. She could tell by the tone of Caitlin's voice that something wasn't right. "Danielle, I've just received a complaint from a longtime customer," Caitlin said, her words tight. "They're upset about the training, about the changes we're making to our policies. They say it's too political and alienates the real customers. And there's more. Apparently this customer is connected to some of our top investors." Danielle's pulse quickened. She leaned back in her chair, trying to control her emotions. "How bad is it?" she asked, her voice measured. Caitlin hesitated. "Well, they're threatening to pull their investments unless we reverse some of the changes. Specifically, the bias training and the new reporting policies." Danielle let out a slow breath. She had known there would be consequences for taking a stand. She had anticipated the resistance from both inside and outside the company. But the fact that her own investors were now questioning her commitment to these changes made her stomach churn. "I need to meet with them," Danielle said, her voice calm despite the storm brewing inside her. "Set it up. I'll handle it." The following day, Danielle stood in a sleek, glass-walled conference room at Grayson Trust headquarters, facing a small group of investors. They were a mixture of older men and women, business titans, people who had put their trust in Grayson Trust from the beginning. Their presence was commanding, their expectations high. The conversation began cordially enough, with pleasantries exchanged over coffee and small talk, but Danielle knew what was coming. She had been in enough meetings like this to know the drill. It was only a matter of time before the real issue was brought up. "Danielle, we appreciate the direction you've taken Grayson Trust," said Peter Caldwell, one of the senior investors. He was a tall man in his late 60s, his gray hair neatly combed, his glasses perched on the edge of his nose. "But we've heard from some of your larger clients, and frankly, the feedback isn't good." Danielle listened intently, her hands folded neatly in front of her. "I'm listening," she replied, her voice steady but firm. Peter continued, his tone growing more pointed. "These clients are upset about the mandatory training. They feel it's unnecessary, political, and frankly, divisive. And now we're hearing that even some of your own employees are disgruntled. This is going to impact our bottom line, Danielle. We've already seen some of our larger corporate clients threaten to withdraw their accounts if these policies aren't rolled back. You need to reconsider." Danielle's pulse quickened, but she remained calm. I understand your concerns, Peter. I've heard the same things. But here's the reality. Grace and Trust is built on fairness. We can't be a bank that preaches diversity and inclusion while turning a blind eye to the biases that exist within our own walls. What happened in Indianapolis was a wake-up call for me. And if we don't act now, we'll lose the trust of people who truly believe in what we stand for. Peter's eyes narrowed slightly. But the world isn't just about what we believe in, Danielle. It's about making money. If we alienate people who don't agree with your stance, we won't be able to continue running this bank effectively. Danielle felt a surge of anger, but she forced herself to stay focused. What's the point of making money if it's at the expense of our integrity? At the expense of treating people with respect? If we allow bias to continue unchecked, then we're no better than the very institutions we claim to stand apart from. Grace and Trust isn't just a bank, it's a statement, and I'm not going to let it become another corporation that panders to the highest bidder. There was a heavy silence in the room as the investors absorbed her words. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. This wasn't just about one conversation. This was about her values, her vision for the future of Grace and Trust. She wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. Finally, it was Sylvia Harris, another investor, who spoke up. Sylvia had been quiet until now, but her voice was steady. Danielle, you're right, she said, meeting Danielle's gaze. We've always said that Grace and Trust is about doing things differently. Maybe it's time to prove that, even if it means a little discomfort. We can't just keep skating by on what's always been done. There was a pause as the others considered Sylvia's words. Danielle knew that this wasn't going to be easy, but if she could get even a small portion of these investors to see her vision, it would be a victory. Peter, still unconvinced, spoke again. We'll need to see the results, Danielle. Show us that these changes are actually having a positive impact, and we need to see some signs that the bank is still making money while you push these new policies. Danielle nodded. I understand. We'll track the results, and I'll report back on the progress regularly. But I'm not reversing these changes. This is the direction Grace and Trust is moving in, and if you're not on board with that, then we may need to reevaluate our partnership. There was another long silence before Peter finally sighed. All right, Danielle, you've made your case. We'll hold off for now, but we expect you to deliver. Danielle gave a small nod. I will. Thank you for listening. As the meeting concluded and the investors filed out of the room, Danielle felt a strange mixture of relief and tension. She had stood her ground, but the battle wasn't over. It was only just beginning. She glanced at her phone, which buzzed again with an incoming message. It was from Angela Ford. Training update. We've had over 80% of employees complete their bias training with positive feedback. We're seeing a shift in attitudes, and we've had a number of customers praise the new reporting system. Looks like we're on the right track. Danielle smiled slightly, the weight on her shoulders easing a little. This was the change she had hoped for, but she knew it wasn't enough. Not yet. Grace and Trust needed to keep evolving, to keep proving that it was more than just another corporation. It was a place that valued people, customers, employees, and everyone in between. The road ahead was uncertain, but Danielle was ready to walk it, step by step. She had started something, and she wasn't going to stop until it had the impact it needed to. Not for her, not for the investors, but for the people who trusted Grace and Trust to do better. And she was going to make sure they always had a reason to believe in it. The months that followed Danielle's meeting with the investors marked a turning point for Grace and Trust. While there were still challenges to overcome, the company had begun to see the positive results of the changes she had implemented. The new bias and inclusion training became a cornerstone of Grace and Trust's identity. Employees were more aware of their biases, more attuned to the needs of customers, and more willing to hold themselves and others accountable for their actions. Danielle continued to make her rounds, visiting branches, speaking with employees, and listening to customers. She spent time in the lobbies where she had once been just another customer, and she paid attention to how staff interacted with people from all walks of life. The subtle changes were beginning to add up. Employees were no longer simply going through the motions. They were engaging with customers in a more authentic, respectful way. Grace and Trust was becoming the bank she had always dreamed of, a place where fairness, trust, and inclusivity were not just words but lived values. However, the road was not without bumps. Some customers, particularly those from long-standing relationships with the bank, were resistant to the new approach. They saw the changes as unnecessary or divisive. Some even decided to leave Grace and Trust altogether. But Danielle knew that no matter how difficult, the right thing to do was always worth fighting for. She held firm in her belief that real change would only come if she stayed true to the mission. One of the most significant shifts came when Danielle initiated a new customer outreach program. It was designed to educate customers about the bank's commitment to inclusivity and fairness, and to show them the positive impact these changes would have. Through workshops, informational campaigns, and open dialogues, she helped bridge the gap between the bank and its customers. Slowly, the narrative began to change, and many customers who had once been skeptical started to see the long-term value of these policies. It was a gradual process, but over time, the backlash lessened. The support from the employees, however, never wavered. Many employees, especially those who had previously felt like their voices weren't heard, found new motivation in the changes. They felt like they were working for a company that truly cared about creating an inclusive and respectful environment. For Danielle, that was the ultimate reward. It wasn't just about increasing profits or improving the bank's reputation. It was about knowing that she had made a real difference in people's lives. The final step came a year later when Danielle stood at the podium in front of a room filled with Grace and Trust employees, community leaders, and investors at the annual company conference. Her speech was simple but powerful. "We've come a long way," she said, her voice steady and full of purpose. "When I walked into that branch in Indianapolis, I had no idea that it would lead us to this moment, but sometimes it takes something jarring to wake us up. And I'm proud to say that because we took action, because we refused to accept the status quo, Grace and Trust is better today than it's ever been. We're not just a bank. We're a community, a place where fairness is more than just a policy. It's a principle that guides every decision we make. We've built something lasting, something that reflects who we really are, and we're going to keep building it." She paused, looking out over the crowd, her gaze sweeping across the faces of people who had supported her, who had believed in the changes, even when it wasn't easy. "Real change doesn't happen overnight," she continued, "but it happens because of people who refuse to stay silent, who refuse to accept things just because that's the way they've always been. It happens because of people who stand up when it's hard. And I believe we've all learned that." The applause that followed was long and heartfelt, a testament to the fact that Danielle's vision for Grace and Trust was not just a dream anymore. It was a living, breathing reality. The lesson from the story. The story of Danielle Grayson and Grace and Trust is one of perseverance, integrity, and the courage to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult. There are several key lessons to take away from this journey. The power of leading with integrity. Danielle's willingness to challenge the status quo, even at the risk of alienating key investors, shows the importance of leading with integrity. True leadership isn't about pleasing everyone. It's about staying true to your values and vision, even in the face of adversity. The importance of accountability. By making bias and inclusion training mandatory, Danielle set the foundation for a culture of accountability. She didn't just implement policies, she ensured that people understood them and were held accountable for living them out in their everyday interactions. The necessity of challenging uncomfortable truths. Danielle's decision to walk into the bank as a customer was a bold move that forced her to confront uncomfortable truths about her own institution. This act of self-reflection and willingness to face uncomfortable realities is essential for growth, both personally and professionally. The long road to real change. Change doesn't happen overnight. The resistance that Danielle faced, from employees to investors to customers, was real. But she understood that true transformation takes time, effort, and a commitment to pushing through challenges. The key is to stay focused on the long-term vision, even when progress feels slow. The power of community and support. Danielle's success wasn't hers alone. She had the support of employees, customers, and even some investors who believed in her vision. Real change happens when people come together to create something bigger than themselves, a shared vision that everyone can work toward. Speaking up for what's right. Above all, the story teaches the importance of speaking up when something is wrong. Whether it's an injustice, an oversight, or simply a feeling that something isn't right, standing up for what's fair and just is not only essential for personal growth, but it also has the power to inspire change on a larger scale. In the end, Danielle's decision to confront the issues within her company not only transformed Grace and Trust, but also set an example for other leaders to follow. She proved that it's possible to succeed without compromising values, and that the courage to make difficult decisions can lead to a better, more inclusive future for everyone involved.